as Southern Sudan evolves into a new country, by your assessments, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities?
I think Sudan, as it emerging the new Sudan, I think there are several key things that has to be focused. The first one is how to build democratic institutions that are able to effectively provide the necessary services that are needed. I think also the questions about management of the country and ensuring that the country is able to manage itself as it emerges out of this. We must appreciate that so far the Southern Sudan government has a large weakness in terms of its ability to have a control over the entire country. So we need to think about how do you build institutions and capacities in them. There's also a question about a defranchised population, which is largely coming from violence and war for more than 20 years, and which means that we have to ask ourselves, how do you come up with the processes of managing the differences between these various ethnic groups and also managing their expectations? I think also there's questions about resources and how those resources are going to be exploited and how people are going to benefit out of those resources and the dividends and opportunities that accrue out of exploitation and the utilization of those resources. There's also a question about how do you build economy that is able to guarantee access to livelihood and social infrastructure. And also the questions about who is going to finance the development and how are we going to tackle the question about prudent management of the finances and management out of that. I think also the question of the Southern Sudan government has been accused for a long time because of corruption issues. How are we going to tackle that? Do you have institutions competent enough to deal with that? Because if that's not dealt with, then the resources can become another big problem in terms of how you manage that.
Okay, so a full scale of issues, from human development to governance issues to financial institutions to security issues. Let's deal with the question of security firstly, because that's really been the bugbear, for lack of a better term. The country emerges from over 20 years of civil war with the north. They also have the general question now of territorial integrity and this issue of demarcating borders between north and south, and huge amounts of money being spent on securing Southern Sudan at the moment. Do they have a grip on the problem?
I think the fundamental problem here is the questions about how do you build a significant and very efficient and effective law and order maintenance system. And the first question we should be able to ask ourselves is, how do you come up with a competent, able security sector? And what I mean by this is that we must come up with the mechanisms and legal frameworks that are able to do the following things. One is that come up with a legal framework that governs arms control. Sudan, you must understand that the entire of the population is a population that has depended on the guns as their means of livelihood. So we have a huge population of guns that are still roaming all over. So how do you control it? The second thing is the questions about how do you build the military, the police. Currently, Sudan has an estimated 125,000 army population, but you see that army is largely very scattered, it's fragmented, it has different interests, but you need to come up with an army that is well solid, that has all the necessary competence and logistical support that it needs. We have a police force that's about 28,000, but this police force is ill-equipped. It doesn't have the necessary professional training and equipment, so we have to ask ourselves, how do we help in terms of building that? But I also think that the entire population itself, I think we have to change its mindset from a war mindset to a more modern society. And that in itself calls for a well-concerted effort on how to do with that. I think the other key issue is whether we can create institutions that can manage to have a control over the Southern Sudan borders, particularly the international borders specifically. And we must not forget that we have not yet resolved the entire border question between the north and the south. Okay,
well, the leaders are saying that they're trying to address that before the July deadline. To you, what does economic security mean? We keep on talking about the oil economy, but of course there's vast tracts of land, there's questions around food security, and there's also issues about access to the waters of the Nile Basin.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying that, you know, one of the biggest things that people need to understand is that in just between 2009 and 2010, within intra-Southern Sudan itself, we had close to an estimated population of about 2,500 people who died, and another of about 350,000 who got displaced. And these figures are given by one of the most authoritative agencies based in, on the literacy report on the gangs, the groups, and what it means. And one of the things they have pointed out is that the competition over access to resources, particularly water, pasture, and also in terms of access to basic livelihoods, is going to be the most contested areas. And also we must not forget that the ethnic relationship between various ethnic groups will also play out, because some of them are either economically pastoralist or they are farmers. So how are we going to balance these two groups where we have not set up a mechanism on how we are going to centralize the economy?
Human development issues, I mean, statistics suggest that over 80% of people in southern Sudan are illiterate. Poverty is pervasive. There isn't any real infrastructure for hospitals and schools, just basic things that are needed by way of public and social goods. Social security in southern Sudan?
I think that's the point I began with when I was talking about establishing and building institutions with the capacity. Because if you don't focus around that, I think it's going to be a big problem. And one of it is that we need to appreciate that the southern Sudanese need to own their economy. They need to own their country. And for them to be able to do that, we must invest massively in terms of building the capacity of those people. Even when we outsource, we must be very careful so that we don't create another dependency economy on the outside. And we must always appreciate that in many of the countries that are emerging, like Sudan, the southern Sudan, many of them have faced serious challenges around building their local competences. And I think the key thing that we must focus here on is how do you balance in terms of outsourcing and the local competence that we can be able to make available.
The role of donors, I mean, we have been told that the international community has been forthcoming with aid, food aid in particular, but just general ways of helping southern Sudan re-establish itself. Are we going to see donors coming through? Are they going to be setting conditionalities?
I think one of the key things that actually the previous meetings of the donors is that they have made a lot of commitments in terms of reconstructing southern Sudan as a new state. But that time they were arguing it from a point that the comprehensive peace agreement was going to be achieved, and the various milestones that have been set were going to be realized without actually collapsing the comprehensive peace agreement. Now that it's almost certain that we are going to have a new country in the name of southern Sudan, I think it is important that donors put in money, but they must be overcautious. They do not create an over-dependency culture. They should be able to invest much of that money towards creating systems and infrastructure that is necessary to actually hold up southern Sudan and be able to make itself grow and emerge as an emerging economy that is self-reliant.
Security threats to the rest of East Africa. I mean, lots of scenarios have been pointed out ahead of the referendum. The propensity for war, the likelihood to return to war, the intensity of that war. And the estimations are that if there was any pervasive insecurity, it would cost southern Sudan $50 billion per annum just to secure its borders, and it would cost countries like Kenya and Uganda $25 billion. What are the threats of war ahead of July, and how is the rest of the region addressing the sense of insecurity?
I think the big point is that we must not look at the security issue of southern Sudan in isolation of the bigger region. Because one of the interesting things about this region is that wherever a conflict arises in one country, it has always had this significant impact of spreading across the other countries. A good example is that when the war erupted in northern Uganda, it affected South Sudan, it affected the Democratic Republic of Congo, and all that. So we must look at this in a bigger picture and put it in the right context. I think the second thing is that we must look at the next steps. And the first thing we need to appreciate is that the referendum that was conducted was not the end of the comprehensive peace agreement in terms of this next specific areas. One of it is, I think, its ability of the North and the South to be able to have what you can call a peaceful divorce. They divorce peacefully in a very amicable way, and then they must understand that they need to work together towards mutual benefits that benefits the new states. Because if they don't do that, that has a huge implication. And this is specifically so because both sides, both the North and South, had one big problem of using proxies to be able to engage each other in war. And those proxies has not been disbanded. The militia groups has not been disbanded. We still have a huge problem in terms of the boundary, making it clear where the boundary lies between the North and South. And also more importantly is where the oil fields will lie by the end of the day, and who will be finally processing the oil and who will be producing, and how do you share those two?